Thanks for listening to the Archbridge podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wilterdink, and today I'll be talking with Kay Hymowitz. Kay is the William E. Simon Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal. She writes extensively on childhood, family issues, poverty, and cultural change in America. Kay is the author of numerous books, including Manning Up, How the Rise of Women Has Turned Men into Boys, and Marriage and Caste in America, Separate and Unequal Families in a Post-Marital Age. She has also appeared frequently in popular media, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and many other outlets. So, Kay, thank you for coming on today and joining us.
Happy to be here. Great.
Well, I want to kind of kick things off with an area that you've talked a lot about, which is higher education. I think we all sort of recognize that higher education, as it's traditionally thought of, is sort of not working very well, to put it lightly. So we've got, skyrocketing student debt, which has become now political football with, sort of the, debt forgiveness and that kind of stuff. Yet we still have a lot of underemployed graduates. The quality of the education that people are actually receiving seems to be declining. All around, this is a pretty not great picture of things. So can you explain a little bit about why it seems, despite all of these different trends going on, people are still very much invested in that college mentality and kind of pushing everybody into that college system?
Well, I think that's a function of the policies of previous administrations and this one as well. The assumption is that college is for all. You've heard that mantra many, many times. And I think what's becoming clearer over time is that it's not for all, and that we've made the mistake of associating a four-year degree with a successful life. We've told people, how much more they'll earn, how much more stable their jobs will be. And there's some truth to that, but there are also plenty of what we used to call blue-collar jobs, I guess they're still called blue-collar jobs, that offer a decent life and pay fairly well. I'm thinking particularly of the trades. And we ought to be offering a lot of students who are now thinking they must go to a four-year college, this other option, these other alternatives. I think that one of the big problems is that we're sort of confused about what the purpose of community colleges are. And we should remember that only about a third of our graduates, high school graduates, get a four-year college degree. So many more of them might be interested in some alternative, and a lot of them go to community college. But there's a lot of confusion about what the purpose of the community college is. So a lot of people go thinking, well, I'll get my 2-year degree and then I'll transfer to a regular college and get my 4-year degree because college for all. But then but historically, and I think in a lot of people's minds, community college should be more vocational and more preparing kids for the workplace, and also more local, more regional, so that the kids who go to a local community college know that they're entering a place that is where people are aware of local labor needs, of what employers want, of what jobs are available. And that should be more of our orientation about community college. I actually have some statistics here I was sort of amazed about. 81% of students entering community college are hoping to get a BA.
Wow, that's a lot.
That is a lot. And 14% of those will do so. So this is a complete failure, education failure, on the part of higher education, very generally speaking. And in addition, the other amazing fact to bring in is how few people actually even get their 4-year degree who enter a 4-year college. dropout rates are very, very high. The data I have here is that 65% of high school grads enter post-secondary institution, only a half earn any degree. So this is, obviously we're doing something wrong. We've prepared kids poorly for adult life, for their future labor force participation, and we have to do a much better job than what we're doing.
Yeah. It seems, those statistics are pretty shocking. I mean, especially when you consider how many kids, they'll enroll, and then if they don't get that degree, they're still often saddled with a lot of debt.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they don't have the degree that can help them get to that higher that higher pay scale there as well. One thing I was thinking about is, I think part of this funnel towards the universities has been, the focus on college prep, this, college for all sort of mentality that we've been living with for at least a few decades now. I mean, I'm about 10 years out of college, and so about almost 14, 15 years out of high school, and it was very much drilled into me, you will go to college, like everyone's going to go to college, like that's a must do if you want to be anywhere in the middle class. A lot of this blue collar stuff didn't really come up at all. And that's kind of a shame, but I also think that there is something to be said for, with the exception of some of the blue collar jobs, stuff that, you mentioned, where people can learn a trade or learn a skill or a vocation, and they can still earn quite a bit of money, and often for a lot cheaper than a college degree. So that's like part of the equation, is getting people a little more attuned to those opportunities and getting them a little more well known. But on the other hand, it is still, they call it a college wage premium. That's still very much a real thing, where people who graduate college, at least, tend to earn a lot more than people who don't. But I almost sort of think of it now, it's less of a college premium, and it's more of like a non-college punishment. Like we're sort of the labor market, and a lot of those returns, it's almost like if you don't go through the motions and get those degrees, you're punished for that in the labor market. And so I wonder, this does seem to be something with employers on their side as well. I mean, we're seeing the credential inflation sort of balloon. And so I've got some quick statistics on that. I'll just point out one here that really jumped out to me was, for executive secretaries. I think the study that I read recently, it's a Burning Glass study from 2014, but about 19% of executive secretaries and executive assistants hold a bachelor's degree, but 65% of the job postings require one. And we're seeing that sort of dynamic replicated across a lot of different industries. So can you talk a little bit about credential inflation, how that might be playing into this whole, failure of higher education?
It's such an important piece of this puzzle, because not only are we seeing the ill effects of a college for all mentality, but now a lot of students who get their BA feel pressure to get a master's or a PhD.
Right.
A PhD is a little bit different, but the master's has become a kind of add-on. And what I show in my recent piece in City Journal is that the master's is the new BA.
Oh man.
What I mean by that is that about the same percentage of people who had a BA in 1960 who graduated from high school or who were in the labor force, now it's about the same percentage who have a master's. And there are more and more employers who are using the master's as a filtering device when they're hiring. They have their personnel departments and they're overworked and they don't want to make any mistakes and they don't want to take chances. So they think, here's an easy way to deal with that. We'll just look for master's degrees or higher degrees. In addition, what happened some time ago, and this was before the College for All mentality even took hold, is that big companies used to train people a lot more than they do now. And for various reasons, they stopped. It could have been because so many kids were going to college that they felt they didn't have to do it anymore. But that was kind of part of the package of going to work right after high school. You went to an employer, the company trained you for your job, and there was a kind of mutual loyalty expected in those relationships. So that worked out pretty well, I guess. That stopped as companies started to really worry about the bottom line, to see that they could get college-educated people without training them and thinking that they would be well equipped. But it sent colleges into a development spree where they thought, oh, okay, here's an opportunity for us to develop all these new programs that will train people for the workplace, because they'll need that since the workplace isn't providing it. Well, the bad news about that new arrangement, of course, is that the students who might have been paid to have a kind of apprenticeship with a new company are finding themselves with debt instead. And this is just at a time that in the past they could have expected to settle down, to marry, buy a home, have children. Instead, they're going into debt to get these degrees that, not in every case, but in all too many cases, don't seem to add that much, don't seem essential to the work that is, or the skills that they are expected to have. If we had a better system, K through 12 system, I think the pressure for this college degree would ease a lot. So there's a problem also. Yeah. But it's also the companies themselves unwilling to do as much training as they used to.
I wonder, are you familiar with the work of economist Brian Kaplan,
yes,
who published a book, The Case Against Education, a few years ago? So in that, as you're aware, he sort of argues that this is all kind of a smoke and mirrors signaling game. I guess, to be generous, he doesn't say it's 100%, just a signal, but in terms of trying to see if a college degree might be actually learning skills that are applicable in the workplace that can make an employee actually more productive versus just signaling something important to the employer. He definitely falls on the side of signaling over the more development side. So it sounds like that's something that you sort of agree with. Do you agree with his conclusions there, or do you take issue with some of that, or how do you see that work as well?
Well, I half agree. I mean, there's no question there's an awful lot of signaling going on here, and also an awful lot of status jockeying as well. If people want to have the degree because, especially if it's a big name college or university, they like being able to refer to that. That's one. And if they can get a doctorate, they'll want to refer. Some people want to be called doctor. They really like the status associated with that. So there's no question signaling, status jockeying, all that is at work. But I guess where I would caution is against putting so much pressure on, so much credence on that, because I do think something happens to people when they go through 4 years of college. First of all, they're 4 years older, and they've matured.
Yep.
And they're around people who are aspiring students, aspiring workers. And there's more opportunity for communication development, for lack of a better term. And you do hear from people in the business, in the admissions business, that, and in personnel, that a college student or somebody who has graduated from college just sounds different. They know how to present themselves. There's a lot of complaints about kids who don't look at you when you're talking with them. They don't, they give one word answers. They don't have what one of them called polish that a college student seems to have. And I take them at their word on that. I think that is probably true. But my question is, well, why aren't we doing that, providing that polish, those communication skills in K through 12? It seems to me one of the obvious things we would be doing.
Yeah.
So, so I think the signaling issue there's a little more truth to it. Or rather, it's not just a matter of a shallow signal, but there's something really substantive that kids gain by being in a college environment for 4 years, by having to speak with professors, prepare for exams, all of that stuff actually may accomplish something in their soft skills,
right,
even if it doesn't produce that much in the hard skills.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that definitely seems very plausible to me, just from my own experience on some of that stuff.
Yeah.
One thing that you mentioned that I'd like to kind of go back to is this idea of status. This is something that and I don't mean, you and I, but I think that in general in the policy space, people are a little reluctant to talk about that, or maybe that's just a function of it being really impossible to sort of measure. But I do sort of see that as a component of, maybe one of the reasons why the blue collar job opportunities haven't gained sort of the popularity and the steam that they would seem to warrant given their return on investment. And I think status is definitely playing a part in there. So can you talk a little bit about that? Do you think I'm right in that, or how do you see that?
I absolutely think you're right about it. And I think that people without a college degree feel it acutely. We are a very polarized society at the moment. I don't need to tell anybody that. They know it. But a lot of that polarization has to do with education. Mm-hmm. In fact, I would say that's the dominant divide right now. The college educated on one side and those without a college degree on the other. And there is a tendency for those with a college degree to assume, well, at least some of them, I don't want to accuse everybody of being this way, to assume that people who don't have a degree they're not as educated. They didn't, maybe they're a little stupid, maybe they're ill-informed, and to not respect what skills and abilities they do have. Now, as somebody who can't both my husband and I are so incapable of fixing anything in the house, and I have a lot of respect for people who can do that stuff. So I like to think I bring some of that attitude towards dealing with people who are not educated. But there's no question that we tend to be attracted and to align ourselves with people who are more like us. And education seems to really create a tremendous divide right now, not just because of politics. I think it's also cultural. Mm-hmm. We watch different TV shows. We eat different kinds of food. We have different language we use, and it's not just, fancy words. It's just a way of expressing ourselves. And that, it's very salient. It's very hard to get away from. And I think that one reason people don't want to talk about this issue, Ben, is we're all implicated.
Yeah.
It's a very, very hard thing to overcome. I know for me, in my own dealings with people, and I assume that that's true for everybody. But it's something that has to be looked at really carefully by the educated class, because we have a crisis in this country with our less educated Americans who are completely resentful and untrusting now of experts, of people who might have some expertise that they can learn and that they should be paying attention to. We're seeing it right now in relation to the COVID vaccine. But it goes far beyond that. And I do think the resentment from the less educated is very profound. I'm right now sitting in a resort town where there are about 3,000 people who live here year round, and then there's another, 6,000 or 7,000 who arrive in the summer. And the tensions, the town gown, we used to call it, town gown tensions, are there. And the people who live here all year are resentful that they're expected to act as the servants, the service class. And I think that's okay if there's dignity attached to that. And we haven't been very good at finding a way to express that and show it in our dealings with people who are not like us.
Yeah. No, I think you're right on with that. I mean, we are all sort of implicated in that. I think most people who would listen to or watch this conversation are probably part of that more educated side. Right. I hope not. I hope it's more broadly viewed, but just realistically, I think that's probably true, and that can be really challenging. I think part of the issue here is, I think one of the most destructive sort of fallacies that's out there is this idea that wealth creation is a zero-sum game, right? Like if somebody has more, then somebody else must have less. And I think about that, I'm growing a little more convinced that status might be something that is a bit more zero-sum, where, if you have one group or one category that has more, it might actually mean that another is just functionally has a little less. So I'm, that's one of those half-baked things. I won't say that I've fully thought that completely through, but I do think that there is some sort of element of that, and that makes this problem even trickier. Because I would love to just snap my fingers and say, well, it'd be great if these blue-collar jobs had the status associated with them that they do in many cases, like the skill level that it takes, just like what you were talking about, to accomplish some of these things is incredible. But it just doesn't seem to work that way. I don't know that there's a government policy that could affect something as abstract as status, and that makes it very difficult, and that almost sort of puts it off limits to this more educated class as well. Right. Yeah. Something you can feel free to respond to that if you'd like, but those are just some things I've been thinking about. I'm not sure quite how we should tackle that all just yet.
No, I completely agree. There is no policy. This is not a government problem exactly. I mean, let me backtrack a little bit on that. Government could do more to show its support for people who are taking an alternative education route. That would be good. I don't know that would solve the problem by itself, but I have data in the City Journal article. Let me see if I can just look it up here about how much money the government gives to four-year colleges and how much it gives to community colleges and below. And it's overwhelmingly money for the 4 years. So right there you see some sense. And we're doing such a bad job of finding ways to train people for the workforce who are not going to college. And that also shows a certain kind of disrespect, doesn't it? That we're not really focused on trying to solve that. And they're all, yeah. So
I mean, not at all. I mean, on the other side with the college stuff, we have an entire apparatus, designed to sort of support that and funnel that and fund it and, give these, crazy loan guarantees. And, we have whole, industries that have cropped up around supporting that. And we've got, basically none of that on the other side of the equation. So I do think do think you're right in that we are, the government does have its thumb hugely on the scale of one side here. And so maybe just backing off of that or equalizing it would go perhaps further than either of us might expect. It might take some time, but that's probably a good place to start. So.
Well, there are a lot of special interests here.
Yeah. Aren't there always?
Remember, the colleges are very reliant on this income that they're getting from not just undergrads. What I talk about in my City Journal piece is that they're very inclined to develop more master's programs because master's students don't tend to be as expensive to them as undergrads. Why? Well, they don't tend to need dorms to the same extent. A lot of them are doing their degrees online, so they don't need all kinds of student centers and all kinds of facilities that students who are on campus need. So they know that there's money to be made there. Yeah. In addition, the government, here's another way that the government could do something. They have made it possible for graduate students to borrow as much money as they want. And fewer of those loans are subsidized than they are for the undergrads. But nevertheless, people can decide, well, I'm going to get a good job because I have a master's or I have this extra degree and this little plaque with my, with my name on it. So I can afford to take more money out. And people are telling me that's what I need to do. So they do that, and then they find out that they have more debt, and they're not getting the jobs that they thought they were going to get or making the kind of money that they thought they were going to make. So the colleges are adding to this problem by putting so much emphasis on these new programs in masters and PhDs. I actually, in the article, I talk about some of the weird ideas they come up with, because there are people who are sitting around and thinking, what can we offer, that would maybe bring in some more tuition money. And let me see where I wrote this down. For instance, you can get a master's in outdoor adventure and expedition at Southern Oregon University.
Sounds cool.
You can get a master's from the University of Arizona in the racetrack industry.
Wow, that's really specific.
Right. Well, I think that may have been, if I remember correctly, it was a donor who I guess was involved in the racetrack industry.
Okay.
Yeah. You could get a PhD in puppetry at the University of Connecticut. What? I mean, it's amazing, I guess, to me, and sounds like to you too, that people are willing to pay the money to get these degrees, to often go into debt to get these degrees, but they do. And I'm not sure how they get talked into it, but
yeah, that's I don't know how you would really get talked into that too, especially if you were thinking at all about marketability afterwards and using this as like a jumping off point to start a career. I don't know that you could really think about that and look at those programs and think, this is a good investment. I'm probably going to be.
They have their ways of selling this stuff, and I'm sure they have one or two successful people who came out of the program who can come back and talk about how much this has changed their lives. I know that there is a real selling effort to sell and to know people. The Wall Street Journal actually had an interesting article just today about law students who have been promised, they hear about how much money they will make when they're when they get their degree. But in fact, a lot of lawyers are paid nothing like corporate law, nothing even like
right.
but fairly modest. I mean, modest, not compared to poor people, but not that much, not enough to pay off debt very comfortably. So the article was interviewed a number of young people who got their law degree at I'm forgetting the name of the law school in Florida, but I think it's called at any rate, you can look it up. But
I'll make sure we drop a link to your piece here so that people can look at that.
Yeah. So these guys interviewed were just, they told me I was going to be able to make so much money, and they're not.
Yeah.
So I have no question that is partly a function that people are snowed by a strong selling job.
Yeah.
Done by these departments, and that
whole mindset is very institutionally supported, by our government as well, and all of these programs and systems in place for that too.
Right.
Man. Well, to kind of switch gears a little bit, I know this is probably still related to higher education a bit, but one of the things that I think you've been focused on talking about and researching. I first saw you discuss this at the Joint Economic Committee in your testimony last year, but it's this issue that you've termed the Marriageable Men Problem.
Right.
And that is something that I don't hear, quite a few people really talk about, but you really hit on it in that testimony. And again, I'll link to that so that people can read your full remarks there too. But can you just give us a little bit of an explanation of what the Marriageable Men Problem is and why you think it's something that we should focus on?
Well, this is very much related to education. Men are not going to college at the same rate that women are. A lot of these working class people who are going to community college are men who are struggling to figure out what to do. They don't, I don't want to generalize too much, but there are a lot of men who don't like sitting in classrooms and taking notes and reading books, and they have other interests. About 57% of our college graduates now are women, and that's could be fine, but the reality is that women don't want to marry down, and quotation marks down. That is, we're talking about status, by the way.
Right.
Women, we have plenty of research on this, even after all these years of successful young women, the people getting degrees and higher degrees and making firsts, in every field. But they still tend to find men, if they do marry, they tend to marry up. Mm-hmm. That is, men who are making more money than they are. Mm-hmm. The education marrying down is a little, they're willing to marry down if the men make more money than they do. It's not universal, so I hope nobody out there is going to start saying, but my wife makes more than I do, and it's fine.
Right.
I hear that all the time, and there's no question that there are a lot of people who are doing that. But statistically speaking, what we've seen, and by the way, this is not just in the United States, is that women are going to prefer a guy who is at least their equal, and mm-hmm. hopefully makes a little more than they do. The research that I've seen comes not just from the United States, but from Denmark, mm-hmm. And Sweden, places that are pride themselves on their egalitarianism. My own view, which you can accept or not, is that this is probably just built into our natures, male, female natures. We won't go down that rabbit hole, but
no, I suspect that you're right about that. I mean, at least from the the reading that I've been doing and being a human, I think that that there's definitely an element of that going on. And it's not just about income. Like you're saying, like income, I think, is often sort of the proxy for status, or some other desirable trait. But I think that you do see sort of, you can have, women working at, these law firms making incredible sums of money, but if their partner, if their husband is, maybe earning less in dollar figures, but it's still a pretty high status job, like say college degree, or a college professor, or, it's not like college professors all make a lot of money. I mean, some do, I guess, but, and that kind of thing, but it's still considered a very high status sort of profession. So it's not all about income, as we're saying, but it's,
right.
But yeah, I think that's so interesting, especially though, I mean, some of it is about income, and as these trends continue, with more women entering and graduating from college at higher degrees, I'm sure that holds true for postgraduate education as well, where women are outpacing men in those kinds of degrees. And so you have that pool of women who are, they're highly educated, they're probably making quite a bit of money, and they're looking around, and the pool of men, that is sort of, in that same category is just, it's getting smaller as they're doing more, as they're earning more. So how do we sort of backtrack out of that? Do you think that it's a matter of changing some of these cultural attitudes, or do you think it's making it easier for to create pathways for men to earn more money that's outside of that college system, as we've been talking about? Or how do you think that we kind of start to address this?
Right. Well, I think it's the latter. And I should have said, as I was talking about the college graduation, the gender gap in college attendance and graduation, that the problem of the lack of marriageable men, and what that means is men who are earning enough, and to be at least equal of the women. The problem is with the people who don't go to college, the majority of young adults, is that they are men are dropping out of the labor force. I mean, something like 10% of non-college educated men have simply dropped out. They're not unemployed because they're not looking for work. We measure unemployment by people who can't find work who want it. And it's hard to know exactly how they're managing. I think sometimes they're living with parents. Sometimes they're living with girlfriends. Mm-hmm. I guess they do a lot under the table. Many are on disability. Mm-hmm. It's a little unclear how many of those really should be on disability. I would say some. Certainly, I'm not implying that nobody on disability deserves it at all. But there are people who maybe are overstating their discomforts and problems. So that's 10%. Of marriage age men who are not working. I mean, that's quite large. And then there just seems to be, men seem to be having more trouble adapting to this post-industrial economy than women are. I would add one other thing that is very controversial. But I think as we've made it more and more possible, or rather more and more acceptable and more possible for women to raise children alone, I think the unintended consequences, the intentions were all good. We want to give women more independence. We want them to be able to leave an abusive relationship. Absolutely, we do. But at the same time, we've increased the number of women raising children alone. And I think that the bad effect of that is that it says to men, you're not needed in this most important activity of raising a family. We can do it alone. That's the message. And I am convinced, this is unprovable, and like I said, a little controversial, that men, it's been very, very damaging to men, that that their purpose in life is just a little unclear. Why nobody needs me, Yeah.
I think that you're probably right about that. And I know from kind of the psychology side of that, one of our colleagues here at the he's a senior fellow with us here at the Archbridge Institute, but he does a lot of his work he's a professor at North Dakota State University. His name's Clay Rutledge. But he's done a lot of research into the role that meaning plays into people's lives and sort of how that affects different things. And one of the key things there, I think sometimes researchers and scholars, can confuse just having social bonds for that sense of being needed. Those are two separate things. It's not just whether people have social bonds or family and friends or what we call social capital, right? That's certainly necessary and that's a part of that equation, but that's not enough. People in general seem to need that extra step, like beyond that. It's not just that people have friends and social connections, but it's also that feeling that you're needed, that recognition that you're needed, that you're contributing something, that that the world or whatever project or whatever it is you're invested in would be poorer if you were not there. And I think that's something that I think a lot of us sometimes can take for granted. If we have that feeling, it's almost hard to put ourselves in the shoes of someone that might not have that feeling at all, in any aspect of their life. And, as you're saying, it could be about employment or being involved in the community, or it could just be in a family, something a little less removed, from the commercial economy. But I think you have to have that sense somewhere in your life. And if you don't, I think that, I would wager that a lot of that 10% that we're talking about of those men who have completely dropped out of the labor force, I think that they're much more at risk of not having that sense. And so I don't know which way the causality runs there. Maybe this is something that sort of overlaps and kind of goes back and forth, but I do think that's really important. And it's really interesting. I've never really heard somebody talk about how some of the shifting family dynamics could be sort of contributing to that, even if, that's true. We see in the data about family structure, right? Where we're having smaller families, fewer people are getting married, and less families are getting to the size that they were. And so I sort of first came across that when I'm looking at different income statistics, right? And so if you look at, rates of economic mobility across generations, it's a really big question of, are you looking at individual income? Are you looking at family income? There's a lot of those studies that say, we're no better off than we were in the 1970s, in certain metrics, but that really doesn't, it's not apples to apples because the family structure, like the family sizes are so different. But there's been a lot of changes, in the past, 40 years or so. And I know that's something that you've written on as well, right? That was, one of your books was focused on that. And I think it's probably important for us to note that, some of this divide about marriage and I think education is a part of it as well. it is very unequal. You know, a lot of the more wealthier income quintiles are still sort of operating in some of these more traditional modes of getting married and staying married. And where we're seeing that sort of break down more is on the lower side of the income scale. Right. And so, I mean, how does that factor into this? That's sort of a mismatch that I'm sure you've seen in the data as well.
Yes. Well, first, let's clarify a few points there. I mean, you're absolutely right, everything you said, but let me repeat. The breakdown of the family, single-parent families, multiple partner fertility, which refers to people who have children with more than one partner, which I've written about recently, divorce, all of these things are much more likely among lower income people. Mm-hmm. And I think than higher income. The fact is, as you mentioned, people who are, and this is related to education, people who are been to college are much more likely to be married to wait to have children, to be married when they have children, and to stay married than people without a college education. Now, so why is that? Most obvious answer, I suppose, would be that it's easier when you have money to make, you don't have the stress of dealing with problems with your bank account or, a car that needs fixing or that kind of thing. And that creates stress and leads to marital breakdown. I think that's a much too simple description of what's going on, because most of these relationships where children are born to single mothers, unmarried mothers, are fairly casual. They're not necessarily long-term relationships. People who have children in a cohabiting relationship tend to have children earlier, faster than couples who are married first. And those couples are much more likely to break up. And I don't think it's just a financial problem. It's something that I've written about quite a bit. I think it's more accurate to say, number one, they don't think in terms of the long term. Most middle class, college educated people are thinking, is this, you go on a date and you're thinking, well, is this somebody I could be married to and have children with? It's kind of a future orientation that you often don't see among young people who are cohabiting and with fairly casual relations. They're not thinking long term often. So that divide takes us back to the inequality issue, because people who, number one, divorce is very expensive. If you want to, really see your household income go down and become stretched, try that. Try divorce. It's a good way to make that happen. And of course, a single parent doesn't have the same support that would child support that they would have if they were married. Hopefully, if they're married.
Right.
So married couples are far more likely to be earning more household income. They build wealth much more than people who are not married. They are more likely to own a home, to be able to keep that home. I mean, one thing that happens when people divorce is that you can maybe have to sell your house. So all of the wealth accumulation that comes with marriage is also going to people who are already educated and already have that advantage. And it just, the divide between the educated and the less educated then isn't just about money. isn't just even about education. It's also about family stability, family arrangements, and the children, of course, of the people who are in relatively unstable relationships pay quite a big price on that. We still haven't figured out ways that the schools can compensate for a very unstable environment at home.
Right. And I think, and in some ways, those schools, that's kind of an impossible task, to ask the schools to take something like that on to compensate for those kinds of inequalities at home. And that's something that, the work of James Heckman, he recently put out a paper with a co-author looking at some studies in Denmark looking at this stuff. And he basically found, he's quoting him saying, family is everything. Family is everything. And that's definitely borne out in the data that we've seen, and a lot of the studies that have gotten a lot more sort of media legs have talked about things like neighborhood effects, which clearly those exist. They're features of the data, but as Heckman would point out, those are basically what we're looking at when we say neighborhood effects is essentially a proxy for family stability and family structure.
Right.
So that's clearly an essential piece of this discussion and of this puzzle. And it actually occurred to me, with the little bit of time we had left, these are all topics that maybe put some people on edge. I think there's some researchers and some scholars out there, who are a little reluctant to really get involved in these discussions. Clearly, you've been very forthright in talking about what you think is really going on. So, I guess one question I'd want to ask you is, do you have advice for other scholars or researchers or people who are working on these issues and thinking through these things of how they might communicate these issues, or what would you like to tell them as they're thinking about what they want to focus on, or maybe how they want to present some of their findings or talk about these things?
Yeah, the trick is, how do you talk about these things without sounding like you are criticizing individual people who have made individual decisions or fallen on hard times, for that matter. So, I have many friends who are divorced, family members who are divorced, who single parents. I'm not. And in no respect am I saying there's something wrong with them, or they're bad people, or they're stupid people, or anything like that. But I do think they are living in a society, in a culture that has made it harder to have a successful or long-term marriage, and it isn't. It's complicated what that problem is, but. I'm talking about that culture. That's How do you get people to understand that is a really tricky question that I've been grappling with my entire writing career since I've started talking about this stuff. But all I can say is the statistics are not anecdotes, and there are all kinds of reasons that people fall into situations that are not ideal, and it's not their fault. They're not making an individual decision. They're doing what's accepted around them, and these are cultural matters. These are cultural norms. If you go and you mentioned before the neighborhood effects. The most famous study on this by Raj Chetty showed that kids who grow up in communities where there are a large portion of married couple families do better in life than those who are in neighborhoods where there are a lot of single parents. And the fascinating thing about that is that even the children of single parents who are in those communities with lots of married couples, they also have get the benefit of a more stable environment. It's quite interesting. And vice versa, if you are the child of a married couple who lives in a community that's mostly single-parent homes, you're going to have a harder time moving ahead. So that shows you this is a communal problem. It's a cultural problem, not just single decision. There will always be marriages that break up, that have to break up. There will always be people who get pregnant outside of marriage, and we're never gonna. I mean, I'm not not utopian about this or foolish about it, but I think that the norms that have developed that say, well, this is okay. All families are alike. All families have their strengths and. That kind of thing, which in the 1970s, as the two-parent family was unraveling, became a very common kind of description of what was going on. The family, it's very strong women taking care of children who really can manage on their own and that kind of thing. Some of that was a racial protectiveness, because the breakdown of the family, which is now includes whites and Hispanics and almost every group, not so much with Asians, but I think what happened was that people decided that it was really dangerous to talk about because it was so much a black problem. And this is the story of I don't know how many of your viewers, listeners are familiar with the Moynihan Report of 1965, but he was the first to notice that the black family was beginning to become fragmented, that more and more women were having children alone, and at that time going on welfare. And people many civil rights activists got nervous about it. Feminists got worried about it. And it basically shut down that conversation for 20 years. You can actually, I'd have to say right now, with new anti-racism initiatives and way of thinking, it's becoming harder to talk about it again. I guess this is a long-winded way of saying I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to have this conversation. I mean, I'm going to keep pushing for it because what the hell, I'm too old to worry about it. But I think a lot of people are going to shut up about it. Another way, it's interesting that we're using this word privilege so much, white privilege and that kind of thing. It may feel like, well, I'm privileged and I don't want to start telling people who are not privileged how to live their lives. It's an understandable reaction, but in the end, it's doing more harm than good, I think.
Yeah, I guess, the best we can do is just tell the truth as we understand it.
I think so. If somebody has found the right language to use, the right framing, I haven't seen it.
Yeah. Well, if I figure it out, I'll let you know, and I hope you will, vice versa. Well, Kay, I really appreciate you talking with me today and taking so much time to do this, and hopefully, we can have you on again as you continue to publish and put out some really good work.
Thank you very much.